Assassins, people without limits who use their time in life to disrupt the lives of others. At the height of their cruelty, they now face the ultimate challenge, tasting their own poison in the face of the death sentence, where their only regret is having been discovered. Witness with us the last day on earth of these dark individuals, unraveling the maze of their disturbed minds as they prepare for the inevitable outcome. David transitioned from minor crimes, such as theft and selling his own body for sexual purposes, to terrorizing the city of Oakland, California between March and December 1980, taking the lives of at least 4 elderly people in their homes. In January 1981, Mason was involved in a police car chase and managed to escape but left his car behind. Authorities used the information obtained from the car to locate his home, where they were able to speak with Mason's mother and brother. The pair provided a videotape made by Mason in which he confessed all of his acts, describing them in detail. He had left the video with his family in case something happened to him. Based on Mason's confessions, a warrant for his arrest was issued, and on February 4, 1981, when police arrived at the Holiday Inn where he was staying, he did not resist and was taken into custody without incident. Mason confessed to all of his crimes, but added one more murder to the list that law enforcement already had. He confessed to having killed his lover, Robert, during an argument because Robert admitted to intentionally infecting him with herpes. Before his trial, Mason was held in Alameda County Jail, where he and a cellmate conspired to take the life of another inmate. At the beginning of his trial in 1983, Mason pleaded not guilty to all charges against him. However, he was found guilty of the 5 murders in January 1984. Mason was sentenced to death and transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained until his execution. Over time, Mason fell in love with a woman named Charlene and married her while awaiting his sentence. As time passed, the convicted criminal and husband opened up about his guilt, admitting to all his crimes and showing great remorse for the harm he had caused. Mason expressed remorse, but no one knew the extent of it until June 1993, when he voluntarily withdrew an appeal that his attorney had filed. Had he allowed the appeal to proceed, he could have obtained a new trial that might have overturned his death sentence, but Mason did not want to seize that opportunity. His execution date was then set for August 24, 1993, at his request. A few weeks before his execution, Mason granted an interview to some journalists in which he described his time on death row. He also spoke about how he understood the pain he had caused to the families of his victims and how he was ready to take responsibility for his actions. Although Mason received over 200 letters from people pleading with him to reconsider his appeal, his mind was made up. As the execution date approached, Mason chose to spend his last day on earth with his family. When asked about his last meal, he refused to make a request and asked for the same food served to the prisoners. In his final hours, Mason requested unlimited access to the phone, opting not to speak with a priest, and his last request was a glass of ice water. Mason was executed in the gas chamber on August 24, 1993. Upon entering the chamber, officials informed him that he had the power to postpone the execution simply by stating that he wanted to appeal his sentence. However, this advice fell on deaf ears, as Mason had decided his own fate and chose to go through with it. When asked if he had any last words, Mason told the warden that he did not. David Mason was the last prisoner to be executed in this manner in California. Few details are known about the final resting place of Mason's remains, but like other death row inmates, his body may have been cremated or buried in an unmarked grave. Carlton Gary is an American serial killer who allegedly assaulted 9 elderly women and took the lives of 7 of them between 1977 and 1978. Throughout most of his life, Gary was in prison for one reason or another, but he was the least suspicious person regarding the deaths of these women at the time of his arrest in December 1978. Gary was involved in a robbery in South Carolina and confessed to this robbery, receiving a 21-year sentence in March 1983. Only 5 years after his sentence, Gary escaped custody and remained at large for a year before being apprehended again. Investigations into the murders of these elderly women by a serial killer nicknamed the Stocking Strangler took a different turn when new evidence led authorities directly to Gary. They found a firearm and a match of fingerprints that proved he was the serial offender terrorizing the city of Columbus, Georgia. Finding his fingerprint at a crime scene could have been a coincidence, but that was not the case, as Gary's fingerprints were found at 4 different locations. Gary was charged with the homicides in May 1984, and although he admitted to being in the women's homes, he insisted that he did not commit the murders and that another person had killed the victims. Despite Gary's attempts to maintain his innocence, the prosecution's case against him was strong, and with all the evidence, he was convicted and sentenced to death for 3 of the 7 murders in August 1986. As a prisoner on death row, Gary was kept in a tiny cell where he spent most of his time in solitude, which is customary for prisoners awaiting this type of sentence. He had 1 hour of exercise per day, a television and a radio in his cell to keep him company. Over the years, Gary developed a keen interest in art and began to showcase his artistic talent. He spent his time hand-making Christmas and birthday cards for people. Gary's life took a positive turn when he got married in 1996, having met his fiancée through a church group that frequently visited inmates. In addition to getting married, he also adopted the woman's daughter. Despite being behind bars, Gary loved his wife and developed a close bond with his adopted daughter. For a long time, Gary waited to be exonerated, but that day never came. He appealed several times over the years, but his sentence remained unchanged. In December 2009, just 4 hours before his execution, Gary's hopes of exoneration were reignited when the Georgia Supreme Court stayed his execution to determine if DNA testing was necessary to prove his innocence or guilt in the crimes. Unfortunately, all hopes were permanently crushed in February 2018 when a new execution date was set for March 15, 2018. During his final preparations before execution, Gary refused to eat his last meal and also declined the offer to pray. Surprisingly, Gary made no final statement before his execution. At the age of 66, Gary was executed by lethal injection at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson, Georgia, which is used by the state of Georgia as an execution center, as well as a museum displaying artifacts related to the history of the death penalty in the state. What happened to Gary's body remains unknown, but it is possible that he was buried in an unmarked grave or that his body was cremated. Gary Gilmore turned to crime at a young age and was first arrested at 14 in 1964. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for assault and armed robbery. Later, he was paroled in April 1976, after which he moved to Provo, Utah with his cousin. There, he tried to take legitimate jobs twice, but failed both times. Frustrated, Gilmore returned to his violent tendencies, stealing from others and drinking. In July 1976, just a few months after his release, Gary Gilmore elevated his status from a common criminal to a murderer. On July 19th, he entered a gas station in Orem, Utah, robbed it, and before leaving, fatally shot Max Jensen, a gas station employee. The next day, Gilmore broke into a motel in Provo, but did not leave before using his firearm against the motel manager, Ben Bushnell. Bushnell's wife witnessed the encounter and saw Gilmore leave the premises with the cash register. Gilmore accidentally shot his own right hand while trying to hide the weapon in a bush. When he returned to a service shop where he had left his truck for repairs before going to rob the motel, the shop owner noticed his hand was bleeding. When Gilmore left, the shop owner called the police and provided the license plate number of his truck. Gilmore was detained with the help of his cousin Brenda, who reported him to the police when he called asking for help with bandages and painkillers for his injury. Gilmore's trial began in October 1976 and lasted only 2 days. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to execution. Gilmore's response to this sentence was unusual and attracted media attention. He accepted his sentence and made no efforts to renegotiate the punishment imposed on him. This response shocked many people and left them wondering why he would choose to accept such a severe punishment. Was he truly remorseful, or did he feel that this path was the only way to end his suffering? During his time awaiting execution, Gary Gilmore led a life of isolation and monotony, as is common among prisoners in this state. However, something about Gilmore stood out. It seemed he was eager to end his life. His execution was postponed several times, and he reacted by going on a hunger strike to protest the delays. He proved his willingness to forfeit his right to live when he wrote a letter to his mother asking her to stop trying to appeal on his behalf. Between November and December of that year, Gilmore attempted to take his own life twice but was stopped in time. In Utah, there were only two methods of execution: hanging and firing squad. Gilmore chose the firing squad because he thought hanging might go wrong. The night before his execution on January 17, 1977, Gilmore requested a simple meal of steak, potatoes, milk and coffee, but only consumed the milk and coffee on the morning of the execution. He was taken to the execution chamber where he was strapped to a chair. Behind him were sandbags to absorb the bullets. Gilmore's acceptance of his sentence was not the only thing that made him notorious. His choice of last words also made him famous. When asked if he had any last words, Gilmore simply said, "Let's do this." After his execution, Gilmore's body was not immediately buried. Although he had been a criminal for most of his life, he performed one last good deed before dying. He requested that some of his organs be donated to people in need. After his death, Gilmore's corneas were removed and sent to the University of Utah Medical Center, and within 24 hours, 2 people received them. On the same day, his body was cremated and his ashes were scattered from an airplane. Wesley Allen Dodd was a criminal whose name is etched in history due to his terrible crimes. Dodd began his series of sexual crimes at the age of 13, lasting a decade, during which he raped more than 50 minors. Under a facade of normality, he offered to take care of his neighbors' children, hiding his perverse intentions. In 1989, his criminal trajectory culminated in a kidnapping incident at a movie theater in Washington. The subsequent investigation revealed the depth of his depravity and the horror of his actions. It was discovered that Dodd was also responsible for the brutal murder of 3 boys in Vancouver that same year. After a detailed confession during a 3-day investigation, a search warrant was issued for Dodd's home. There, investigators found a macabre archive, including newspaper clippings reporting his crimes, a folder containing his victims' underwear, and a photo album filled with images of different minors under 12 years old whom he had violated. The most disturbing discovery was his diary, where he described in detail his murders, methods, and plans for future atrocities. Dodd was subsequently charged with aggravated first-degree murder and attempted kidnapping. He pleaded guilty to all charges and was sentenced to death in 1990. When asked about the method of execution, he chose hanging, a method similar to the one he used when he took the life of his most recent victim. Surprisingly, Dodd made no effort to appeal his sentence. On the contrary, he insisted that his execution was essential for the safety of the world. He stated that he could not be rehabilitated and that if given the opportunity, he would continue to attack children, finding pleasure in it. His statements painted a terrifying portrait of a man who seemed to be beyond any chance of redemption. While awaiting his execution, Dodd used his time to raise awareness about child abuse. He gave interviews to reporters, participated in television programs, and spoke openly with anyone willing to listen. Even while advocating for his own execution, he wrote a self-defense manual for minors, offering tips on how to protect themselves from people like him. On January 5, 1993, Wesley Dodd was executed by hanging in an internal gallows at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. His execution was witnessed by local and regional staff, members of the victims' families, and prison officials. Surprisingly, his last words reflected a change of perspective as he claimed to have found hope and peace in the Lord Jesus Christ, encouraging others to seek the same. Dodd's execution was a rare event in the United States, as he was the first person to be executed by hanging in over 30 years. After his execution, his body was transferred to Seattle, where an examination was conducted, followed by cremation, with his ashes being given to his family. Death row inmates often exhibit varied behaviors in their final hours. Some resist until the end, while others accept their fate with serenity. Dodd, however, requested a swift execution. Individual choices during these agonizing moments remain unpredictable, and there is no definitive way to determine how someone will choose to spend their last hours on Earth.